Hey, I'm Max and welcome to my Unity Basics video. In today's video, we'll take a look at rigid bodies and collisions. So what is a rigid body? Let's say I create an enemy here, which is just a sprite renderer. And as you can see, my enemy here just has a sprite renderer and it doesn't move or do anything. If I hit play here, you'll see that the enemy is just static, doesn't move, doesn't fall, doesn't do anything. Now if I add a component rigid body 2D, and I hit play here, you'll see it falls down because the rigid body by default applies gravity. So in my case, I want a side view, so I don't want any gravity, so I'll set the gravity to 0. And now that the gravity is 0, you'll see that it doesn't fall or do anything, just like before. That's because our rigid body doesn't have any velocity. So let's just create a C# script and give our rigid body some velocity. So in our script, what we want to do is do private rigid body 2D and call it whatever you want. And that's because we want an instance of the rigid body so the script can access it. To get the right rigid body, we just have to do rigid body equals to get component rigid body 2D. And that's going to get the rigid body on the same object as the script. Now I will create a public vector2 so we can set the velocity in the editor, the velocity that we want. And over here in the fixed update, I'll do rb.velocity equals the velocity. So this is the velocity of the rigid body and this is the parameter that we had here. So over here I'll just add component and my script is called tutorial. And now if I give it a velocity of let's say 1 on the x value, it moves at the speed of 1 unit per second on the x value. Now let's duplicate this enemy, and on this other copy let's give it a velocity of -1 and I'll move it to the right over here. So if I hit play here, you'll see that they both move towards each other, but they move through each other. That's because they don't have any collider. So let's give them a circle collider 2D on this one, and let's give this one the same thing, circle collider 2D. And now let's hit play, see how it looks. As you can see, they collide and they turn around and then they each go their way. Now if you don't want the enemy to spin around after a collision, you can go in the rigid body, open up constraints, and freeze the rotation. Okay, so now if I give it a higher velocity, you'll see that when they go over each other, they keep going like at in a very snappy way. That's because they don't keep the velocity from their collision. So you see when they hit each other, since they're kind of one above the other, they should fly up and down a little bit. So if we want to keep the velocity from the physics, we cannot set the velocity to our vector because that's going to cancel the physics. So here, instead of setting the velocity, we can do add force and then velocity. And now since we don't reset the velocity but instead just add to it, it should keep the direction from the physics. So as you can see, this one keeps going up and this one keeps going down a little bit. Now in the rigid body we have a mass parameter that's going to affect how much one object or the other moves when there's a collision. So you can see when they're both 1, they both slow down the same. But if I set this one to 5 and the other one I keep it at 1, now you'll see this one doesn't accelerate as much from the force, but it also doesn't get knocked back as much from the impact. So now I'll set this one's velocity to let's say 10, and now you'll see that this one will look way more heavy because it's not going to move as much. So you can see the other one moved out of the way a lot more than this one moved. You can also set the drag to prevent it from accelerating too much. Now here, if I go back in my script and I do a void on collision enter 2D, which is a function by Unity, I can do debug.log and then collision.gameObject, which is going to say which game object we collided with. Now if I run it and I check the console, you'll see that it will say which game object we collided with. So both of them printed the name of the other game object. Now if we go in the collider and we set it as trigger, both of them, or even just one of them would work, now you'll see that they don't collision anymore. They go through each other. If a collider is set as trigger, it will not act as a solid, which means that you can go through it like it's not there. So then you might wonder, what is a trigger for? Well, as you can see, now that our box collider is set as trigger, it doesn't print in the console anymore. That's because it doesn't send a message to onCollision enter 2D. When your collider is a trigger, it sends it to onTrigger enter 2D. And we can do the same thing here, debug.log collision.gameObject. So as you can see now, our collider is set as trigger, and we have our untrigger event, and it sends a print message to the console. This can be useful, for example, if you want something to trigger when the player enters a room, but you don't want to put a collider there because that's going to prevent the player from entering. Hopefully now rigid bodies and colliders are clear to you. Feel free to check my other Unity tutorials for tips and guides on how to make games, and subscribe if you want.